Right, good afternoon. Welcome to the last session of the last day of NDC Oslo 2019, and I do appreciate your stamina getting here. Thank you very much. My name's Andrew Coates. I'm a software evangelist at Microsoft, and I spend a lot of my time talking to big companies, small companies, partners, and others about how to write software. And one of the things I always try and tell them is this: only write the code that only you can write. Writing code that someone else has already written, or commoditized, or just done, seems like a pretty big waste of time to me as an engineer. And so the value you bring as a software developer is really all about your understanding, your knowledge, your capability in the particular domain, or the particular application, or the particular industry that you're in. There are lots of things that we don't need to do anymore. It'd be crazy to write an email system, for example, or a calendaring system. There are plenty of those around. Equally, in some ways, it's crazy to write an identity system, because there are plenty of identity systems out there. The problem with identity systems is there are so many identity systems out there. And if we want to understand who people are when they come to our application, when they're not from our organization, we need some way of consolidating that information. And there used to be a number of ways of doing it. One is we could write a brand new identity system. And of course, lots of out-of-the-box frameworks ship with that. SQLite or a SQL database sitting in the back end, and a sort of username and password thing. And if you got it right, sometimes you manage to hash the string before you stored it in the database. And otherwise, Troy Hunt got you on his website, all that kind of stuff. But really, identity is I won't say it's a solved problem, but it's a pretty much solved problem. Yeah, we know how to do identity, and we can do it pretty well. So what we're going to talk about today is, what is this concept of identity as a service? How do we take advantage of identity that already exists? And particularly, we're going to drill down into Azure Active Directory B2C, or business to consumer. And B2C is a bit of a misnomer. We'll talk a bit about that as we go. Certainly, business to consumer works, but there's a whole bunch of business consolidation piece that you can do with Azure Active Directory B2C as well. We'll investigate some of the components of B2C. How's it made up? We'll look at how you set up your Azure B2C infrastructure and how you use it in writing your own application. We'll talk a bit about some of the advanced scenarios you can undertake with Azure AD B2C. And then finally, at the end, I'll give you a bunch of information about pricing and where to find documentation and how to get support, all that kind of good stuff at the end. I think that's what we're planning to cover today. Let's talk about why this concept of identity as a service. And I've kind of touched on it already. Imagine, for example, you're a large football club. Some of you may recognise this coat of arms here. Real Madrid decided they wanted to set up an application or a portal for their fans. And some of you may know that Real Madrid have a few fans. Yeah? And trying to manage the identity for all of those fans is probably not a task you want to undertake as a general rule, because most of those fans have already got identities elsewhere. Many of them on Facebook or Twitter or, who knows, even GitHub, some of them. There might be some Real Madrid fans who are on GitHub. So what Real Madrid did is they used an identity consolidation framework, Azure Active Directory B2C, to allow people to log in from using any one of these social providers and store additional information about that particular fan in an Active Directory, but all of the authentication piece is handled by these additional providers. So they don't have any of the hassle of updating passwords or even storing passwords. All they do is they store the additional information they need about that fan. I don't know, where do they live maybe, or are they a season ticket holder, or those sorts of things that aren't stored in the other identity provider. Yeah? They can get the claims from the other identity provider to find out who they are and what their email address is and all those sorts of things, and work out that they are who they say they are. And then they can use Azure Active Directory B2C to store that additional information. I was going to put the crest of the government up here that I'm going to talk about here, because that would be poor. I'll give you a hint. They have a very similar accent to mine. We're doing some work with a large government department in my part of the world, where they are consolidating data across all of the government entities. So all of the various departments, but also other agencies, quasi-autonomous non-government organisations, a bunch of those sorts of things. And they're doing it at the level where they're not just doing data that is publicly available, but also is protected data. And you'd think a government would have a single identity provider. Not so much. Like many big organisations, they are a conglomeration of organisations that have developed their own IT infrastructure over time. And particularly for government, it's very difficult for them to decide that one or the other is the right one. So you'll find that one of the departments might be using Azure Active Directory, another might be using some bespoke identity provider from somewhere else, another one, and in fact there are probably 5 or 6 different types of identity provider, and actually each of the departments and agencies has their own instance of whatever one they've got. And so what they wanted to be able to do is have this capability of being able to log in to their system through their current identity, but store some additional information about what they had access to in this whole of government protected data sharing place. And so what they've done is they've used Azure Active Directory B2C to take the identity from whichever agency they're from, add some additional information like which data pieces they have access to, and store that locally, and then put an application in front of that allows people to log in with their own credentials, but where they have control over how those credentials map to various roles in the system. And this is really powerful because, again, it means that the users don't have to worry about having yet another set of credentials. They don't have to, and the agency doesn't have to worry about managing all of those things around provisioning new users, taking people on board, fixing their problem with their lost password, because you'll never believe people lose their passwords or forget that, particularly in government. I don't know how that happens. The beauty of this is that they can concentrate on the task at hand, which is actually being able to share data safely across their government areas. And so this capability of using identity as a service has really been a powerful step forward for them. By the way, I'm playing with a new feature of PowerPoint. If you haven't seen this new feature of PowerPoint, this is what they call a Zoom agenda mode. And so if you've got sections in your PowerPoint document, you can click a button that says, okay, I'll make you a slide for a slide that has each of those on there. I could click on these if I wanted to, but it'll show you where we're up to. So we started with our introduction, and I'm now going to move on to what is Azure AD B2C, and then you'll see as we go through. So hope no one gets vertigo, but that's what's going on here. So what is Azure ATP B2C? Well, it's an identity management service, as I said. And it allows users to self-service signing up or signing in, to resetting their passwords and editing their profiles. And that is if you decide to keep their identities only locally. Because you can with Azure AD B2C, just set it up as an identity store that has all of that capability inbuilt. But it still means that they can provision themselves. People can come to the portal, enter their email address, get sent a verification code, create a password, and have that manage that themselves. So that's a possibility. So that's certainly one thing it does, and it allows all of those things. It also allows us to store custom information about users, information that wouldn't normally be in a directory. So we can add extended properties and have those things automatically pop up as saying you need to populate these fields before you can sign up, and give people the capability of modifying those fields as well. So, for example, one of the canonical things they talk about is shoe size. If you happen to be a shopping site and you want to know someone's shoe size, well, they need to put it in there, but that's the sort of thing that you don't normally keep in your Facebook profile or on your Twitter profile. But you do want to keep it on your shopping app. Yeah? So if I sign in with Facebook or Twitter, I really want to be able to store that not in Facebook or Twitter, but on my shopping app information. So I can store that as custom information. And I can use multiple identity providers, as I said. Social identity providers, definitely, and I'll show you a list of those later on, but they include things like Facebook and Twitter and Google and Microsoft accounts, but also things like WeChat and a couple of other of the Chinese providers, and also GitHub and a few others that I can't remember off the top of my head, but we'll see as we go through. But lots and lots of them. And that's just the ones that are out of the box. It also is completely OIDC compliant, so any OIDC identity provider can be integrated into the system through what they call custom policies. And in fact, any SAML provider can as well as SAML 2. Let's just make sure that we concentrate on that. SAML 2 provider. And also, you can do custom authentication using REST services with the extended capabilities of the experience framework. So Azure AD B2C is really this identity as a service, identity management, identity capability. That means you don't have to write lots of that stuff. And because it's backed by Azure Active Directory, lots of the things that we already know how to do in terms of building applications on top of AAD just work. And I'll show you how, for example, when we do a demo, how I'll integrate Azure AD B2C with a standard .NET Core application and just get it to do all those things that you need it to do with very, very little configuration required. So the bits that make up AAD B2C are basically three. The first one is an Active Directory, Azure Active Directory tenant. There actually is a tenant. It's got a few extra bits on it, but there's a place to store user information. And we actually do make a user for each user that logs in from whatever identity provider they log in from. It's basically a placeholder that allows us to store additional information. And we'll see that as we go through in a minute as well. So that tenant holds that information about the users and the additional information that we talk about. In addition to that, we have applications. And the applications are the things that talk to Azure Active Directory B2C and kick off a user journey. And a user journey is the process a user goes through to sign up and sign in, or to change their profile, or to update their password and so on. And basically, here's what happens. The application directs that user to run a policy. So when someone goes to get a resource, if the resource is protected, or if they've specifically gone to sign in or sign up, then the application redirects them to do this thing. And this thing is defined in a set of what they call policies. And in fact, the user journeys include a user flow, we'll talk about it in a minute, and a custom policy, which means you've got a whole lot of flexibility about what you can do. The user completes that journey, or completes the policy, and that will be whether they need to log in. It might give them some additional tasks to do, like register their shoe size, for example, or whatever it happens to be. And the application gets a token back, and it uses that token to go and access that resource, just like we normally do with our identity pieces. We can go and the resource server goes and validates the token, and then finally, the application can every once in a while go and refresh that token, because we don't want a token that lives forever, because then we could be susceptible to attacks. So that's the basic application interaction, and we'll see that in action in a moment in the demonstration. But that's what an application is. So we've got the tenant, which stores information about the users, and we've got the application. And then finally, we've got this concept of user journeys. And there are two types of user journeys. In fact, the top one is actually a subset of the bottom one to some extent. It's just what we call user flows are a standard set of out-of-the-box things that you would normally do with identity. Sign up, sign in, change your profile, reset your password. And it does that for a number of different providers out of the box. So again, those identity providers that I talked about being available out of the box. So just we basically have a click and go. I'll show you in a minute the difference between the two. Custom policies are much more about being able to have ultimate flexibility in how your identity system works. And so custom policies are really things like being able to intercept as you step through the flow to check whether someone's a member of a group, for example, or make a REST call to go and do something else as part of that flow. Yeah. So this is straight out of the docs, and I wanted to call out a few of these things. We talk about user flows as being available for everybody. They're the as a service piece that identity as a service piece. This is you don't need to be an identity expert. We've commoditized it for you. Here's how you just get everything set up. And it's configured through the Azure portal. It's all clicking buttons and setting configurations. You get to customize the UI. So you'll see the UI in our demo, and it's a very bland UI to start off with, but you've got complete control over what it looks like. You got HTML, CSS, JavaScript even running in your UI. And you can customize it with multi-language support as well. And that's a fairly straightforward thing to do with resource strings, and just being able to make it available for whichever browser, whichever language has been identified through your browser or your application. You get both standard and custom attributes, as we talked about. This idea of being able to the normal sorts of things like display name and email addresses and those sorts of things come through, but you also get to store shoe size and whatever else you want. And as I said, there's a whole lot of local or social identity providers you can use, and most of the OIDC providers are available out of the box, and you can certainly add more later. On the custom policy side of things, which you configure through an XML file and then upload into the portal and download again, we've got a whole lot of we've got all those capabilities we've got in the user flows, but we've got a whole lot of extra stuff as well. So any standards-based OIDC, OAuth, or SAML2 standards compliant implementation of an identity provider is available. And you can also, as I said, do this integration through REST APIs. And we can do all of the other tasks that we could do in the user flows, but we can do other things as well. So we've got the ability to define our own steps in the user flow. The user journey, and say, hey, when you get to this particular point, if we haven't got any claims back from the system yet about what group someone's in, go and look up a template user, provision that, and find out what groups they're in, and provision that user that we're just currently logging into those groups, for example. And so we do this in that government situation I was telling you about before. We're using custom policies. And we've got exactly that process where a new user from a particular department signs into the system for the first time. We give them a default set of groups that they belong to, usually just data reader groups for their particular organisation. And that means that they can then at least get started with the application. If they want access to other things, then we have processes for them to apply to be members of other groups. But for that particular set of groups, we provision them automatically. And we just have a couple of template users that live as users in the Active Directory, which we go and look up using the Microsoft Graph and provision the new user with those template users groups. So lots and lots of good things you can do there. It is lots more complex to configure because there are a number of XML files that interrelate. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about some of the advanced scenarios and particularly about a tool you can use to help you overcome some of that complexity. So we've talked now about the components. Let's talk about how you go about setting it up. And in the simplest terms, there are really only two steps to setting up Azure Active Directory B2C. First one is creating a tenant for your Azure Active Directory B2C. And the second one is adding some user journeys, which we talked about before. And in fact, that's really all there is to it. Of course, then that's the setting up piece. Then you've actually got to call it through your application somehow. We'll get into that in a minute. But I thought the easiest way to do this is to actually show you a demo of how this works, and that's probably will make the point most easily. So, which way are we going? That way. So I'm on the portal, the Azure portal here, and I've logged in with my credentials for my subscription. I have a subscription on this attached to this set of credentials, and I'm going to create a new resource. I'm going to create a resource which is a new Active Directory, but it's actually a B2C Active Directory. And this is one of the differences that you'll find straight away, is that Azure Active Directory, although it is Azure Active Directory B2C, although it is based on Azure Active Directory, when you create a new directory, you need to be doing it through this process, not creating an AAD and then trying to convert it. You really want to do this first because it sets a number of attributes on the directory for you as it goes through. So we can create an Azure Active Directory B2C, and then we hit create. And what we're going to do is create a new AAD B2C tenant, and it asks for some information. What do we want to call it? NDC Oslo B2C 2. I've already got a B2C, so we'll just call it B2C 2. And we might do this NDC Oslo B2C 2 on Microsoft.com. That'll do. We can put it in a number of different places, not everywhere, but Norway does work. And we hit create. Now, I could hit create there and we could sit there for about a minute and watch it go brrrr, but we won't. I've done one of these already. So I'll close that. But once you've done that, what you need to do is link your B2C tenant. Now, this doesn't seem like this is a non-intuitive step to me. Like you can create or link, but if you create, you've then got a link. So now you hit the link button, and it says, hey, you've created a B2C tenant. Is this the one you want to link it to? In this particular case, I don't have any more found better because I've already linked it. But this is where you choose that one you just drop down, and you'd say what subscription it is, and either create a new resource group, which I tend to do for all my new B2C tenants. I don't know if you guys have this habit with resource groups in Azure. I create them willy-nilly. For any project I'm doing, there's at least one resource group that everything for that project goes into. And then if I decide that I don't want that project anymore, I can just delete the resource group and everything goes away, rather than having to hunt down every single thing that I've done. So that's pretty cool. So I usually create a new resource group and put it in there. Once we've done that, again, that will take another minute or so to create, so I won't do that. I've done one of those. But if I go back home into my dashboard, here's one I did earlier. And what you'll get is this Azure AD B2C settings, and I'll have to log in again, B2C settings blade. And this is the blade where all the magic happens. So I've now set up my Azure AD B2C tenant. That's the first step in that process we talked about. And I've got this working here. And you can see down the left-hand side here, there's a few things that might look interesting. There are applications, which we'll get to in a minute. We've got identity providers. Again, we'll get to those in a moment or two. And then we've got our user flows down the bottom here, plus our user attributes. Now, one of the things I wanted to show you in the user attributes is that I can add new user attributes. There are a number of them which are built in. You can see the city and the country and region and the display name. These are standard user attributes that are built in. But down the bottom here, you can probably see one called shoe size, which is the custom. I'll see if I'll bring it up a bit higher. This one called shoe size. And it's basically a string, and I've entered the description. And now that attribute will be stored potentially with every single user. I've got the ability to store that attribute with every user. And I'll show you later on how I've got the ability to receive it back as a claim which I can use in my application. Adding those is really simple, by the way. Hitting the add button, you get exactly the same dialog as we had before, and we could add another one called, I don't know, head circumference. I'm sorry I haven't spelled that correctly. Yeah, anyway, head size. Now, we could do this as an integer if you wanted to, particularly if you were a metric system person like I am, and most of you are, I'm sure. We could do it in centimeters. Really annoy our US friends. And we hit create, and what's going to happen is that now we also have a head size custom attribute, and we can use that as we go through as well. And so these are the sorts of things that you might add. Might be other things like Twitter handle or website or whatever it happens to be that you are using. So that's our user attributes. The next thing I wanted to show you in here was so applications. So this is the piece that makes this is the piece that allows you to flow through the system. So an application, and I'm going to add a new one. What do you think I'll call it? Maybe test app 3. This application is going to be a web application in this particular case. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a reply URL in here, which is actually mainly for testing and demonstration purposes. And this is something that's probably worth doing when you first set up your Azure AD B2C as well. So I'm going to go to https jwt.ms. And what this does is it takes whatever gets passed back to it and assumes it's a token and just decrypts it for you so you can see what's inside it. Yeah, so we're going to do that. We'll create that, and now when we call through our process, what will happen is it'll go and do our authentication piece, and it'll show us what the claims are that are coming back. And it's a really simple way of having a look at that. And I'll hit create. So there's our test app 3, which for some reason has gone between test apps 1 and 2. Maybe it's sorted by application. I don't know. Yeah, looks like it. Anyway, so we created an application. And the application really is basically a way of saying that I want to be able to call user journeys. So that's what we better do next, is some user flows. So remember I said that we had a number of different user flow types. I'm going to create a new one, which might be our sign up and sign in. There are lots of different types of user flows we can create out of the box. These are the flows, remember, not the custom policies, which we'll talk about later, but these are the things that are available for you out of the box to use. So if we look at these recommended, there's a sign up and sign in, which is what people would hit when they either go to the site for the first time or when they want to log back in. There's their profile editing, which allows them to change those custom properties or those claims that we are keeping about that person in our Active Directory. And there's a password reset one, which you can use for if you are doing their password, looking after their password for them. But in addition to that, there are a number of others. And if we look at all, there are things where you can just have a sign up or just have a sign in. And that you might have a different flow or a different set of claims that happen as part of that process. So when someone's signing up, you might want to say, I want to make sure I capture these additional things. I don't care about getting them back, but I want to make sure I capture these things. So you put them in the sign up. But when they're signing in for this particular application, I don't care about that. But I want to make sure that when someone signs in through a different application, then they can get those other claims. So when they sign up, they have to do this particular thing. And the lovely thing about user flows is that they're decoupled from the application. Multiple applications can use a single user flow. Yeah. And user flow, there can be a number of different user flows that go to an application. So it's very powerful because it means that you can mix and match. In this particular case, we're just going to do our standard sign up and sign in. And we'll call it something original like sign up, sign in 2. Next thing we need to do is choose an identity provider. There's got to be at least one. And I want you to ignore the fact that Facebook is there because that will actually, I'm going to show you how to add identity providers later. Out of the box, you'll only see this one called email sign up. So that's what we'll put in there for now. And I can also switch on multi-factor authentication. So I can say that every time someone logs into my system, regardless of how they log in, they're going to need to authenticate with a second factor of some sort. Usually that's an SMS, sometimes it's an email. I'm not going to turn that on for now, and there's 2 reasons. One is it takes a little while to provision, but the second one is that it actually costs more. And when we get to the pricing piece, I'll tell you about free versus not free and how MFA means that you're immediately not free, even though you're in testing and things. And then down the bottom here, I say, well, as part of this process, what attributes do I want to capture and what claims do I want to return? So the capture piece is when I sign up for the first time, what are the things that I want people to make sure they've filled in or I've got the information I've got from them? And then the return claim is every time I sign up or sign in, what information do I get back in that token? So in this particular case, let's see some more. And let's get their country and region for both collecting and returning, and their display name, both collecting and returning. Let's get their head size, because we just added that, so we'll look to see what happens there. Their postal code, and maybe their shoe size. And we'll click OK. That'll do for now. That's enough information. Maybe that's the additional information we want to be able to use in our application. So we'll click OK. And that's done, and we'll click Create. And now we have a user journey for the signing up and signing in piece. So whenever someone signs up or signs in, and well, let's have a look what it looks like. So the sign up, sign in 2 is the one we just did. What we can do is we can run this flow. Now, one of the beautiful things about Azure AD B2C is that in the portal itself, you can actually kick off the authentication process so you can see how that bit works. One of the great things about identity as a service is that it's just that piece. It's atomic. And you don't need to have your entire application running just to see how the identity piece works. So we'll run this flow. We'll use test app 2. No, test app 3. That's the one we just created, which is going to go back to jwt.ms. And yep, that's great. So we're running the sign up, sign in 2 user flow through the test app 3 application, which goes back to jwt.ms. I'm going to run that user flow. So the first thing it asks me is to sign in with my account. Now, my LastPass is being very smart because it's been here before, so it's trying to fill all those details in for me. But what I can do is I can sign up now. I don't have an account here. I'm going to sign up now. And again, my LastPass is being smart. I'm going to fool it by using something else. And the first thing you'll notice here is it says, hey, you need to get sent a verification code. So I know that you actually control the email address that you're using to sign up with. So I'm going to get it to send me that. And a trap for young players is that most of the time that verification code gets sorted by Outlook into the other folder, not into the inbox folder. So if you're looking for it and it hasn't turned up, that's probably why. There we go. I have it now. My verification code is 292662. I'm actually going to enter it incorrectly just to show you what happens if I say verify. Yeah, it doesn't like it. Okay, now it knows I am who I say I am. I can generate a new password. And I'm from, let's just say in this particular case, I am from Norway. And notice, by the way, because this is a standard set of claims, it's actually got pre-populated this list of countries or regions you could be from. I didn't have to enter any of those things. The identity as a service piece did that for me. Is my display name. My head size is about 62 centimeters. Yes, I have a very large head. And I'm an 11.5 EE. I remember that from last time as well, but there we go. So I'm going to create that. What's going to happen is it's going to redirect to jwt.ms. Yep, very good. Store yourself away. And here's the token it returns me. Now, obviously, you can all read that. But for those of you who can't, down the bottom here, we've got it decoded. And the things you'll find, I've got this thing called extension head size. I'm actually going to write down exactly how that comes out because we're going to need that later. Lowercase extension, uppercase H. We've got our postal, the name, the country, postal code, the shoe size, and so on. So that's great. And if I were to run this again, I'll close this jwt.ms. I'll rerun this user flow. And I will log in with my andrew.coates and sign in. That password is verified, and I get another token back. But it contains the same information. So now I know that the flow works. I can sign up and I can sign in. And isn't that a whole lot easier than having to run your own application and work out where you are in the flow process and work out which token's going where? You just go to the portal and say, I want to run the identity piece. I don't care about anything else at the moment. I just want to make sure I can log in and the claims come back that I expect to come back. I think that's pretty neat. All right. So that's cool. Yeah, so it's a post. It's a standard OAuth compliant process, and it comes back with a JSON web token. Yep, the usual stuff. All right. And this is purely for debug purposes. You wouldn't normally pass it jwt.ms, but jwt.ms is a client-side token decoder. Yeah, so the token itself doesn't ever get passed anywhere else. It just, in this particular case, we post it. We send it back here, but it's just a way of you could post whatever you wanted in that box up the top there, and if it were valid JWT, then it would decode it for you. And in fact, we do this quite a bit when we're debugging things like calls to Microsoft Graph, and we're trying to work out why a particular permission has failed. The token will have the scopes in it that the token has passed, and putting it into here will actually show you in plain text what those scopes are, and you can work out whether you've got the scopes you need and whether you need to add and so on. It's actually a really useful tool. Great. So that's the first user flow. We need to add another user flow, which is our password reset user flow, because we've said we are using email as the identity provider. What that means is that we are keeping passwords in our Active Directory. Now, I said before that probably wasn't a smart idea, but there are some times when that makes sense. And this identity as a service capability does give you the ability to do that, but it allows the users to look after their own destiny in terms of looking after their passwords. And to enable that, we have a password reset functionality. So we can add one of those too. So we'll add another user flow, password reset. And this is going to be password reset to. Notice, by the way, that Facebook doesn't show up here. That's because you don't get to reset someone's Facebook password. They have to go and do that on Facebook, which is what we hope they do. But in this particular case, we need to say you're going to reset your password using that email address. We could enable multi-factor authentication just for this piece if we wanted to, but again, we're not going to. And in this particular case, all we want to bring back from the password reset is their object ID, because we might want to do something with it and say that yes, they've reset their password this number of times or whatever it happens to be. Yeah, we could bring other stuff back if we wanted to, but in this doesn't make a whole lot of sense to bring back their shoe size from their password reset flow. Yeah, so we'll just bring that back their object ID. Okay, and we'll hit create. And once again, once it's been created, password reset 2, we can just run it to see if it works. Test app 3 is what we're going to run it on. It's going to come back to jwt.ms, and we'll run the user flow. Now, there's a different UI here. The UI simply says, "Hey, what was your email address?" And I'll send you a verification token to make sure it's okay. So, once again, we'll andrew.coates@microsoft.com and say, "Send me the verification code." Okay, and once again, we'll have to have a look here. And it is really quite quick that it comes through, as a general rule. That's always a dangerous thing to say, isn't it, as you're waiting to do something live on stage. But in this case, it's come through quite quickly. 258819. I'll verify that. Yep, and I want to continue. Now it's going to say, okay, what's your new password? And I can regenerate my password or type something in and hit continue. By the way, a different password's going in there each time, thanks to LastPass. I don't even know what it is at the moment. It's been stored away in LastPass for me. I love that. And now that's all happened, and it'll go back to jwt.ms, and you'll see that this time the only thing that's come back, other than the rest of the standard claims, are the object ID for this particular user. Yeah. So that's pretty neat too. In fact, if I look just at the claims, it's just the claims that are there. Yeah, if I look at the claims, there we are. Great. So now we've seen how to add those to user journeys, and there's a whole bunch of others you can add as well. As I said, you can, even without getting into the custom policy piece, there's a whole bunch of user journeys you can add, user flows you can add. Great. So that's how we set up Azure Active Directory B2C. That's the identity piece. So now let's talk about how we add those identity providers. In particular, I'm going to talk about Facebook, but there are, as I said, a number of them. So let's do that. Adding identity providers is actually a pretty straightforward process as well. There are a couple of little gotchas. The first one is that you need to do one thing in the Azure Active Directory piece that is not the B2C blade. And so remember I said that Azure Active Directory B2C has got an Active Directory tenant behind it? We're going to put an application definition inside that tenant, because it is an application that's going to go and talk to whatever the identity provider is that we're using. In this particular case, Facebook. So we need to put an application definition in there. We also then need to say to the identity provider, in this particular case, Facebook, hey, we're creating an application that's going to come and ask you for identity. So we need to do that as well. We need to connect them up somehow, which is actually pretty straightforward to do, particularly in Facebook case. If you're doing some other things, there's a bit more configuration to do, but Facebook's really simple. Basically, you need a client ID and a secret. And then we need to add the identity provider to our flow or flows. So enough talking about that, let's just do it. So the first thing we need to do is go and add an Active Directory application. And as I said, the place to do this is actually in the Active Directory blade, not in the B2C blade. And the way we get to the Active Directory blade is down in here. We go to Azure Active Directory on the left-hand side, or we can just go into up here and start typing Active. But we can just choose it in the thing on the left there. And we go to this app registrations, legacy app registrations. There's a bit of configuration to do here. I'm going to view all my applications. And I've got one here already, the NDC Oslo app. This has been added automatically, by the way, this other one. But this one is the one I added. And creating these in fact, let me create a new application registration. We'll give it a name, tell it it's a web API, and give it a sign-on URL. And the sign-on URL is just the application URL that we use in B2C. So all that information is in the documentation rather than you having to writing that stuff down. But if we look at the settings here of this particular one, we've got a name and an app URI, in this particular case, NDC Oslo B2C.onmicrosoft.com, and then a bunch of other stuff around the application ID, but that happens automatically. And then a homepage URL, which is, again, a well-known format that is all documented. I would hate to think you would try and remember it. It's all there. And then we need to add this reply URL. And the reply URL is again a standard format, well documented, that says when Facebook comes back with some information, it knows where it's coming back to. And we put that information in here, and we put it into Facebook, and that's another way that they match up. And if they don't match, they break. It doesn't work. But creating these applications is really a matter of clicking 3 or 4 buttons and entering stuff out of the documentation that is very straightforward to do. So that's our first step. We create an application, and the key piece here is we create an application in the piece that is just for Active Directory, not the B2C blade. And there are 2 places that our applications happen in our B2C world. The first one is where we create applications that we're going to call into, and that's in the B2C blade. And the second one is the place where we create applications that are going to go and talk to identity providers, and that's in the Active Directory blade. So that's where that happens. Once we've created that application, we need to go and do a similar thing in Facebook. Developer.facebook.com in this particular case. We sign in with our credentials, create a new application in Facebook. Again, all documented, very straightforward to do. Click, 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 click. It'd be pretty boring to see it. A little gotcha there is that we need to make sure that we have a privacy policy URL. You can see I've used the standard one for everybody, contoso.com. My favorite privacy policy URL. But it does need to exist. They do go and check. I'm not sure they check what's on it, but they do check that it returns something. And then down the bottom, we have the site URL. And again, that's just our B2C login site, because that's the piece that's going to be communicating back and forward with our domain name. NDC Oslo B2C is our domain name, and then it's a subdomain of B2C login, which is the standard login we use for B2C logins. So we've done that, and we've saved off the application ID and the secret. And you hit show, and it'll ask you to verify who you are and so on, and show you the secret. But you get the application ID and the secret, so you need those 2 things. So I'm going to discard that for now. So now we've done 2 things. We've created an application in Azure Active Directory, and we've created an application in Facebook. Now we need to connect them up. So let's go back to our B2C blade. Sorry, our B2C blade, which is here. Yes. And we're going to go and look at our identity providers, and we can add a new identity provider. And the identity providers in this particular case are multiple. Let's pretend we're going to add Google as an identity provider, and we hit next, and we can add the Google identity provider and hit OK. And then it's going to ask for some setup, our client ID and secret. Now we've done exactly the same thing for Facebook already. Okay, so if I look at my identity providers, I've got Facebook. I've typed Facebook, and I've called it Facebook just for clarity, just in case I get confused. I've got a client ID which I got from the Facebook site, and the client secret, again, which I got from the Facebook site. And that's all the configuration I need to do. This is the beauty of identity as a service. It's a well-known way of communicating. And so I don't have to go through all the process of working out how to pass, what, where, and that all happens behind the scenes. Someone's already solved that problem for me. I can get on with solving the problem I need to solve, which was how to sell shoes and hats to people, with their shoe size and hat size, which I've now captured. So that's great. I've got this identity provider, and what I need to do now is I've connected 2 things. I now need to inject that identity provider into my flows. So I need to be able to sign up or sign in with Facebook. So let's look at our user flows. sign up, sign in, number 2, which is the one we just created. And I look at our identity providers, and I can just click now to enable Facebook. And every one of the identity providers that I've created will now just appear here. And the beautiful thing about this is that I can have identity providers set up for multiple applications or multiple flows, and with the same setup, which is great. I'll save this. I'll run my user flow. Again, we'll go test app 3. And I'll run this sign up, sign in user flow. I've got a slightly different UI now. I'm going to sign in with Facebook. Okay, and I've actually, because I've signed with Facebook before, all that stuff is already there. Slightly different from what it was before. And in fact, why don't I'll get out of there. I'll go back to here. I'll have a look at my users. This one here, sorry. In here, I'll look at my users. I'll delete the Facebook one that was already there. So yeah, this is one that's come from Facebook already. We'll delete that. Yep. And I'll rerun this user flow. Which was this one here. Sign up, sign in 2. We'll rerun that. Again, test app 3. Run the user flow. Now when I sign up and sign in with Facebook, it says, hey, I don't know anything about you. Where are you from? And let's just say this time I live in Antarctica, near enough at the moment. I've got a very small head because I'm very cold, 55 centimetres. I don't know what the Antarctica postcode is. Let's call it ANT123. And I have very big shoes because they are snowshoes. All right, so there's that. Now, had I never signed in with Facebook before on this machine, which is cached all my Facebook credentials, you would have seen a Facebook pop up with a consent dialog that says, hey, this application wants to know these things about you. Is that okay? As you normally would. But as you can see here, I get all the claims back as I would expect to get. And what's more, I get another claim back that tells me the identity provider for this particular set of claims is Facebook, which is pretty cool. All right, so adding identity providers is really cool as well and very straightforward. And again, it's decoupled. It's atomic. That means it's different from all the others. Sorry, it means it's detachable from all the other things, and so you can configure pieces independently. And the great thing about this is that you don't need to rewrite your application if you want to change the way your identity works. If you've got an application that uses Azure B2C, Azure AD B2C, you can just say, you know what, I want to add Google to my application, and I just make these changes here in the portal, and my application will automatically pick up all those changes. All right. Yeah, question.
On Facebook, if you wanted to do something with that user in Facebook, would you be able to get the tokens to access the Facebook stuff as well with their consent?
So the question was, if I wanted to get, if I wanted to use that to do things on Facebook, would I be able to use their tokens? I don't think that's currently possible. I think currently you're getting information back, but I don't think you're able to go and update Facebook things. I need to go and check that for sure, but I think that's it's purely an identity piece rather than authorization piece. Authentication piece rather than authorization piece. All right, let's see how you use it in your app. The great thing about Azure AD B2C is that you can use it for all sorts of things. In fact, many things that you would use Azure Active Directory for. And it's really easy to create an application. It's less easy, although it's still moderately straightforward, to retrofit an application, but it's really easy to create a greenfields application to do this. Visual Studio's got file new project support, and it inserts all of the dependencies for you and makes it really easy to do. So, of course, I'm going to show you that demo because that's the easy one to do. Let's do that. So I'm going to say file new project. And I'm just going to create a ASP.NET Core web application. Let's call it NDC Oslo, just for kicks. I'll keep it in my repos folder, and we'll hit create. This is a dialog you guys, I'm sure, have all seen before. In this particular case, I'm going to change the authentication from no authentication to I do want to authenticate. And I want to authenticate with individual user accounts. Now, this is interesting because previously this used to be only for actually putting a database into your application. But I can now drop this down and say I want to connect to an existing user store in the cloud. And it says, if you want to use an existing AD B2C application, this is where you do it. So, here's where we go. I am going to create a new application. So let's go and do that in here. Let's create a new application. In fact, well, let's create a new application. Why not? Applications. We're going to create a new application. Make this one test app 4. Well, let's call it NDC Oslo just for kicks. And it's going to be a web application. And the reply URL actually is given to us in the dialog here. So we'll copy that. Yep, that'll do. And so we'll hit create. So test app 4, NDC Oslo will come up. There it is, and it has an application ID, which I can copy and paste back in here. Application domain was NDC Oslo B2C, NDC Oslo B2C.onmicrosoft.com. And now we just need to tell us what policies it should run when it runs through here. And this is what wires up our sign up or sign in button in our application to the Azure Active Directory B2C piece. So the policies we want to run, let's go back here and look at our user flows. And this one was sign up, sign in to was the sign up, sign in policy. Oops. We'll put that there. And this one was password reset to. Go the right direction and go there. And I think that's all we'll need. So we'll click OK. Just check that I haven't missed anything there. I think that's all right. Yep, OK. And then we'll hit create. And what's going on here in the background is that we'll get a whole lot of the dependencies, or a few dependencies, all the middle-ware we need to go and do all the authentication piece will get injected in here. And as you can see, we're doing a restore, and all those dependencies in NuGet have happened. They're down in there, or the authentication piece. And what we can do now is just run it. So I'm just going to hit F5. And what you'll see is that we'll have an application that runs using Azure Active Directory B2C as its identity provider. So we'll hit sign in. And there looks a very familiar dialog box. Let's sign in with Facebook. I'll go and sign me in. It knows who I am. Isn't that excellent? Now, that's great, except how do I get at all the other bits and pieces? So let's do a little bit of work just to make sure that we can see some of those claims. I'll stop this. So the place where, let's say I want to look at the claims in the About dialog. I'll use the About controller or the About view to do that. So there's about.cshtml. And this is the standard About dialog. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this little bit of information in here. And let me show you what this is. Alt-Shift-Enter. This is really pretty straightforward. So I'm just displaying what the display name is. I'm going through and finding the claims that are attached to this user. I'm doing a little bit of link to find the one that's actually called the type name. I'm finding the first one, and I'm putting its value out. That's just a string. And I'm doing the same for country, region, postal, and shoe size. Let's do it also for, so I hadn't done this. Let's do it for hat size. And I'm glad I wrote this down because I forgot what it was. Head size, extension _ head size. Okay. All right. The other thing I'm going to do is, Alt-Shift-Enter. I'm going to go into the controllers, and in the home controller, in the about dialog, I'm just going to say you can't get to about without logging in. So I'm just going to add the authorize attribute. Authorize. And of course, I'm going to need to add a using statement to make that work. But now that'll automatically not display unless I've authorized for this particular application. So here it is again. I'll close that. I'm going to sign out because I remembered who I was because it noticed new stuff. I'll go back home. Now I'm not signed in. I'll go to the about. I can go to other pages. I can go to the contact page. I'm not signed in. I'll go to the home page. I'm not signed in. If I go to the about page, automatically redirects me. And I'll hit the Facebook button here. And now there's my logged in user, but all the other details have come down as well. Yeah, so those claims are available to you programmatically to do with whatever you need to do. So if you need to go and do some sort of lookup to find out what the specials are on 15 EE shoes this week, then this is where you go and do it before you show it to the user. Yeah, all those kinds of things. Really, really neat stuff. All right. Oops. Let's stop that. Okay. Right. There are a number of advanced scenarios, and I've talked through a bit about them. The thing you really need to make sure you understand is how the XML files relate to each other. And there are a number of XML files that are associated with each custom policy. You get at the custom policies through this Identity Experience Framework tab here. And it tells you it gives you a whole bunch of warnings saying, watch out. There are difficult things here. Here be dragons. And it's true, dragons be here to some extent. There is some good documentation though. And what's even better here is there are a bunch of samples. And the samples are simply a repository full of XML files, sample XML files that do particular things. And there's a heap of them up on GitHub, so you can get at them there. I'll talk a bit about Stack Overflow and how that works, how to get information out of them as well. But the samples is gold. If you go to the samples area, then you can download custom policies that do all sorts of wacky things, and you can understand how to configure your identity flow using this identity as a service piece. Let's go that way. The other thing to know about the XML files is that they use a basic sort of inheritance. And although you can edit pretty much any one of the XML files, it's best to edit the files that are at the furthest extent of the inheritance. Unless there's some reason for wanting things to flow all the way through, it's better to leave the base file pretty much alone and only edit the extension files. And there's just a best practice in terms of the way things work. You can get very confused is the wrong word, but you can get quite tied up with the fact that things might be in one of 3 different files. So keep them in a understanding that you want to edit things at the top of the tree as much as possible is a really useful one. And then uploading and downloading the files is simply a matter of doing it in the portal. The other key tip I'd give you about these XML files is there's an awesome Visual Studio Code extension. And if there's a picture you want to take of a slide, this might be one of the ones to take it of. This will save you a heap of time. One of the things the XML files do is they have a bunch of magic strings in them, which refer to other sections in other files. And this extension does a lot of the work of keeping these things in place for you. So definitely worth having a look at this extension. And this is a link to the policy samples, but as I said, that's available from that page on the piece anyway. All right. So let's finish up with some of the detail around pricing, documentation, and support. Firstly, I said that it's free with an asterisk. So the first 50,000 authentications you do in any 1 month is free, unless you use MFA. And the MFA, the multi-factor authentication, actually costs you per authentication as a flat rate, no matter what. If you do 1 million authentications in a month, it's going to cost you about 21,000 krona. I did the sums. And of course, this page is available in pretty much any currency that you can buy Azure in. I happen to put it up in Krona because that's where we happen to be. But you know, you can drop down it and make it whatever you like. Yeah.
Is authentication also a new refresh tokens, or just when the user actually presses login in the application?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So the question was, is the authentication, is it every time it does a refresh, or is it only when it does the actual user logging in? I think it's the only user logging in. It's my understanding. Let's chat afterwards, and I'll make sure I find that out for you, and we'll get back to you. But I'm pretty sure it's only the login piece. And as you can see, the price comes down significantly if you're using many authentications. So if you're Real Madrid, and I'm not sure they get 50 million a month, but you know, it's quite inexpensive from a point. You know, if that's your only cost, then you're doing all right. Documentation, heaps of great documentation on Azure Active Directory B2C. Everything from what is it to all the way through all the, in fact, pretty much the tutorial is the demo I showed you today of walking through those things. So if you want to do that yourself, that's pretty easy to do. One of my favorite things that I learned in the last week or so is that all the Azure documentation is actually available for download as a PDF. So if you go to the bottom of the page, on any one of these main pages, there's download as a PDF, and you get that chunk. So this is how do you download all the Azure Active Directory B2C documentation. But all of the Azure pieces have got this capability, and you can just grab them. So if you ever need to fall asleep at night, that's the way to do it. Just grab that PDF, and away you go. And finally, let's talk about support. The guys on the people on the Azure Active Directory B2C team, like many of the teams at Microsoft now, are very strong users of Stack Overflow, and they're very responsive. They actually have teams dedicated to monitoring Stack Overflow and responding. So that's the tag you'd use there, Azure AD B2C. And then if you have suggestions for what you'd like fixed, and there's a number of them. One at the top of the list at the moment is that group claims out of Azure Active Directory B2C don't get passed as a claim. You've got to find a workaround for that. One of the things I was talking about in our government agency is that we've done exactly that. We've had to build a custom flow, a custom policy, so we can pull the groups out of AD using Microsoft Graph and put them in as claims that then get passed on. That's one of the things that's on that feedback forum. But there's a number of other things, and you can vote for stuff, and they're very responsive to that as well. So if there are things that you want to see in Azure Active Directory B2C that aren't there yet, then the team's monitoring and very responsive to that. All right. So we've had some great questions all the way through, and I do realise that it's sort of 5:20 on the last day of the thing. So what I might do is save questions until afterwards. But I do want to leave you with this thought. If you are writing an application and you're doing something that's already been done, apart from the fact that it's very inefficient and perhaps soul-destroying, you're probably going to set yourself up for a failure, because you're not going to build anything that's nearly as robust or nearly as capable as something that's been commoditized. Identity is that times 10. The risks you're taking by doing your own identity are quite high, and the ability to take advantage of an enterprise scale identity capability is something that I think you would be remiss not to at least consider and in my opinion at least, adopt. So I think this is a mantra that you can live by. Again, all of the documentation is up here at ak.ms AAD B2C. And I'd like to thank you for your time, and thank you for attending this very last session of NDC this year. Thank you.